conclude the Africa unit with our last 4 artworks. The first of these artworks is referred to as a Mulberry or reliquary guardian figure. These particular items were produced by the Fang people who reside in what is now called Cameroon, so in the sort of southern end of that nation. So as the name suggests, these figures are placed on reliquaries to guard their contents. You might recall the word reliquary from earlier in the AP curriculum when we talked about Saint Foy. To give you a reminder, a reliquary is a container that basically contains a relic or a sacred object of some sort. Just like we saw with the reliquary of Saint Foy, this particular reliquary contains human remains. So in this case, it is the skulls and bones of venerated ancestors, usually people that were important members of their communities. So the Fang people were historically nomadic and they would not bury their dead in cemeteries. It didn't really make sense for them to establish kind of like a fixed place to bury their important dead, so they would carry them with them in these little bark containers, and each of these containers was guarded by one of these reliquary figures. So you'll notice when you see in this contextual image that the figures are kind of squatting, and they're doing that so that they are able to sit on the lids of these containers here. So the feet dangle over the edge, and this is sort of, and their hands are clasped in this sort of more contemplative gesture. They are intended to protect the contents and then also keep them away from people who are not supposed to interact with them. In a lot of cases, they're apotropaic in nature. They're supposed to basically scare away evil spirits or ill-intentioned spirits, and then also keep the uninitiated away from the sacred remains. So usually like young boys who have not been initiated into this community yet, or women who are not associated with these particular narratives, are encouraged to stay away from these ancestral remains. In other kind of aspects of Fang culture, these figures were actually used in a didactic nature. They were used to teach younger people about the ancestral lineages and about the remains, or the people whose remains are contained inside of the boxes, or they were consulted when considering an important decision. So this is very similar to the Lukasa or memory board that we saw in the second part of the lecture, where you have this object that is imbued with spiritual power and is oftentimes used to teach people or to consult on important decisions. One of the more important things that you should remember about this reliquary guardian figure is this notion of duality and balance. These are very important concepts in Fang culture. To give you a couple of examples as to what that duality and balance looks like. When we look at this figure, we see it has a very large head, particularly a large forehead. These are features that are typically associated with babies and infants. This contrasts pretty heavily with the muscular and kind of more adult proportioned body of the figure. So we have this duality of infancy and adulthood that is represented. The enlarged kind of outy belly button is also something that is oftentimes seen on infants, usually where the umbilical cord has been cut. The bulging muscles, too, are also representing the idea that these figures are supposed to be strong to protect the remains inside. There's also this duality of strength and tranquility. The figures' faces are very placid and calm. The eyes are closed. The jaws are slack. That's representing kind of like this more contemplative nature of the figure. And again, that's contrasting with these kind of like more aggressive looking muscles and the fact that this figure is kind of like engaged in a more active position. Additionally, particularly within Fang culture, infants represent a connection between the living and the dead. So that is something that would be significant to these sorts of reliquary objects, because they are representing these ancestral remains which are used by living members of this community to consult and seek guidance. So there are also several female Mulberry guardian figures that are known to record, and they were usually made to protect the remains of women with large successful lineages. Unfortunately, when the French came in to colonize this particular area of Cameroon, they saw these as idols and kind of representing idolatry. So a lot of them were confiscated, sold, or destroyed, which is how a lot of them ended up in Western museums. Our next piece is called the Veranda Post of an Enthroned King and Senior Wife. This particular work was produced by a member of the Yoruba culture known as Olowe of Ise. So this is actually one of several veranda posts that was created for the palace. This is one of the posts, and this is one of the others. You'll notice that this one, it's in a less ideal condition. Most of the paint has been eroded away, and then also the figures that are at the foot of this of the king right here have since broken off in this figure. So this is one in slightly better condition here. So what you'll notice is that the top of this veranda post is flat. So this is a weight-bearing structure. There would have been 4 of these to support a sort of overhang that was a part of this palatial complex. So this kind of sculpture represents a relatively rare example of the use of negative space in wooden sculpture. Oftentimes you wouldn't see a negative space used in sculpture like this because it doesn't give the sculpture as much structural integrity and it breaks a little bit more easily. And the use of negative space in this particular kind of sculpture, as well as the fact that it was intended to be weight bearing, is really a representation of how skilled and revered this particular wood carver was. So he was highly sought out by the ruling elite of the Yoruba people, including the king, and he was very well known and respected in the community. So we have multiple figures represented. Also, in addition to the fact that like this is supposed to be weight bearing, this is all carved from a single piece of wood. So that is incredibly difficult to do, especially in the absence of power tools. So we have multiple figures that are represented with the king at the center of them. Here he is the dude that is sitting on this throne here. The figure behind him is his senior wife, who has a lot of responsibilities in association with the king. She crowns him during his coronation and also protects and advises him during his reign. So she is hierarchically the largest figure in this composition to indicate her importance. Even if the king was standing, he would probably only be like 2/3 of her height. So the figures also have relatively large heads. Large heads are in the Yoruba culture associated with character and self-discipline. They also have very large eyes, and that's to represent awareness and cognizance. The figures also have these very long necks, which are associated with beauty. So again, these are not intended to be kind of naturalistic representations of these particular individuals, but rather it is an idealized representation showing like a historical and a cultural and physical ideal. The small figures around the bottom are hierarchically less important. We have a flute playing god right here. And a junior wife, and then like on this side there used to be a fan bearer. Our next work is the conical tower and circular wall of Great Zimbabwe. So this complex is a little bit larger than the AP curriculum makes it out to be. What the curriculum tends to focus on is the area that is referred to as the Great Enclosure. The city of Great Zimbabwe was actually this massive complex that some experts speculate supported around 20,000 people, where conservative estimates say around 10,000. But it's only one part of this massive complex that was a part of this massive trading network that the Shona culture established in the country that is now known as Zimbabwe. So this great enclosure area represents a location within this particular settlement that would have likely been reserved for members of the elite. So we're talking kings as well as potentially members of like any organized religion that was happening at this site. It was also a site where commerce happened. So the Shona people were part of this massive trade network that spanned for thousands of miles. There's actually some evidence in this site of Great Zimbabwe of objects that came from as far away as Southeast Asia, to give you a sense of how extensive this trade network was. And this is in like South Central Africa, so thousands and thousands of miles. So the Shona people were able to be so wealthy because of their trade connections, as well as the mining of gold at this particular region. So the accumulation of that wealth facilitated the creation of these massive complexes that were very expensive to make. One of the ways that kings established their presence and their power in the Shona culture was by their ownership of land, the creation of these kinds of structures, which were obviously very expensive to create, as well as the possession of resources. So in this particular case, grain. So this conical tower, which is around 30 feet high, is thought to have been a location to store grain. It was a granary or a silo. So you can imagine that the person who owns all the food, who owns that really important resource, is going to be the person that's at the top of the social hierarchy. So the larger your silo is, the more important and more powerful you are. So there's a kind of scale hierarchy there. The enclosure is surrounded by this massive wall that is around 32 feet high in some places. And the building is, and a lot of these fortifications were made out of granite blocks, which were carried from quarries from very far away. What you'll notice is that these blocks show evidence of deliberate shaping. They are carved to be in this sort of rectangular prism pattern, and it's a little bit difficult to see in this image, but a lot of the walls and the tower itself are trapezoidal in nature. They start off kind of large at the bottom and then they taper upward. So this is very similar to the kind of masonry that we saw with the Incas, which you'll remember is called ashlar masonry. There's no mortar that is holding these bricks together. And unfortunately, due to the passage of time, erosion, seismic activity, and so on, not a lot of the kind of smaller walls and fortifications of the structure continue to survive. So this is a good map right here that shows like what continues to exist, which is mostly the outer structure, and then the rubble is showing areas where these like smaller walls might have once existed. So this was a strategically advantageous location for this particular settlement because it was kind of located on an area that was kind of high in the topography. So it was kind of like on a mesa. That, and the Shona people actually built turrets on the outer surface of the wall so people could actually sit up there and have like a 360-degree view of the area to watch for enemies. So they were able to maintain this area and its security through surveillance, and then you also have the walls, and you'll notice when you look at this diagram right here of the exterior that the entrances and exits are very small. And this was very intentional to prevent people from being able to come into the city and basically overwhelm the forces all at once. So the country of Zimbabwe actually named themselves after the city of Great Zimbabwe. The word Zimbabwe means venerated stone houses in the Shona language. Our final piece in the Africa curriculum is the Great Mosque at Djenné, which is modern-day Mali. So Mali is one of many regions in Africa, particularly in West Africa, that was pretty heavily influenced by Islam. So this is the third mosque to exist on this site. There were two previous iterations that wore away over time. Djenné has served as an important cultural and intellectual center for hundreds of years. Some estimates say around 800 CE at the earliest, and it became a really important location for the practice of Islam starting around 1200, at which point the first mosque at this location was built. So this work represents kind of like the pinnacle of Sudano-Sahelian architecture. This kind of architecture involves mud brick and adobe plaster construction using wood fortifications. The buildings are very unique looking. Usually they have this sort of rough facade, and it's usually like either like a white plaster or bitumen that's covering it, or it's this kind of terracotta adobe color. And you can see the scaffolding, these wooden torrents like sticking out of the building, which are providing both decoration as well as scaffolding where people can actually go onto the buildings and conduct regular repairs. So in this contextual image right here, you can see some people that are actually standing on the torrents and using them as footholds as they repair the structure. So buildings like this, as you can imagine, are subject to erosion and can be really heavily damaged in floods. So they require regular upkeep. And this upkeep has actually become an important kind of like cultural activity that happens every year in Djenné. So there's this massive festival that involves many members of the community repairing and replastering the structure. So this happens every year and everybody has a role. A lot of times there are people who are playing instruments to kind of like keep the mood positive and upbeat. Men are usually responsible for mixing the plaster that is going to cover the facade of the building. Women are the ones who are getting water from the local rivers to kind of like create the mixture. And then there's also elders that sit along the walls and they kind of advise like on where they should be putting plaster and also various techniques that can be used. So it's this massive community effort that happens every year. So there's also a couple of other structural modifications that have been made to the structure to make sure that it doesn't fall apart on the advent of a flood or a rainstorm. There's some vertical fluting along the edges of this particular structure so that if rain falls on the surface, it'll just kind of like slide down and not kind of sit on the surface. So this is very similar to the innovations that we saw in one of our very first AP artworks from ancient Mesopotamia, the White Temple in Ziggurat. There are three main towers here on the Great Mosque of Djenné, and the one in the center contains the mihrab, which you'll recall is that niche that faces towards Mecca. When you look at the roof of this building, it's covered in these little terracotta lids that ventilate the space and keep the interior cool even on hot days. When you look at the interior as well, there's these fans that have been installed right here to keep the air circulating. Mali can get particularly hot. It's an area that's very close to the equator, so these kinds of modifications are required to keep the building habitable during those hot months. What you'll also notice when you look at the building is that it's very compact in the interior, and this is largely necessary because of the construction. This is not a construction that is involving vaulting or not as many arches, and there's a lot of limitations to plaster and adobe construction in terms of how large you're able to go and how much interior space you're able to achieve. And like for safety's sake, there have to be lots of supportive foundations, and as a result, the interior spaces are somewhat narrow. So when you look at the ground plan of this building, you can see that like it's almost hypostyle in nature, where you have these very narrow spaces. Like a lot of the other mosques that we've covered in the curriculum as well, there is a courtyard or san area, which is an outdoor area. So typically when you have like an outdoor and an indoor space kind of associated together, that's very typical of mosques. There's also a couple of other associated structures. We have this relatively short out exterior wall right here, and then there's a couple of other additions here. There's two tombs on either side of the entrance here that are that contain the remains of some historically and religiously significant leaders. There's also been a separate wing that has been added for women to come and worship in. Typically, in contemporary Islam, at least in this region, the men and women typically worship separately. Another kind of design feature of this particular building are these ostrich egg motifs that are on the top of these towers right here. They're a little bit difficult to see in this image, which is why I included this image right here. Ostrich eggs are oftentimes associated with purity and fertility. Egg motifs are typically have that kind of connotation to them.